January 13, 1979. Brooklyn, New York. A quiet office above a wig shop on Rockaway Parkway. The door buzzes. 3 men walk in. Morrie Kessler looks up from behind his desk. He knows the faces. They are not strangers. They are associates, business partners, friends of friends. No shouting. No struggle. One of them raises a .32 caliber pistol. 2 shots to the head. The body collapses beside a rack of hairpieces. In the years that followed, a single explanation would circulate. Morrie talked too much. He was loud. He was annoying. He wouldn't stop pushing for his cut of the Lufthansa money. Hollywood would later immortalize that version in Goodfellas. But that wasn't why he died. Morrie Kessler wasn't killed for talking. He was killed because he understood the math. And in the winter of 1979, inside the machinery of the Lucchese crime family, knowing the math was more dangerous than breaking the code of silence. Morrie Kessler was not a made man. He was not Sicilian. He was not sworn in. He did not sit at tables where captains voted. He owned a wig shop in Brooklyn, a legitimate business, clean storefront, bright lights, hairpieces in the window. But legitimacy was only the surface. Behind that storefront, Morrie operated as an associate of the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families. He was connected through intermediaries, through loans, through favors, through gambling. And most importantly, through James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, an Irish-American powerhouse who, despite never being formally inducted, controlled an empire of hijackings, loan sharking, and airport theft. Burke operated in a gray zone. Not a made man, but untouchable. His crew targeted cargo at JFK Airport, trucks vanished, shipments disappeared, electronics, furs, liquor. Morrie became useful because he had access. He had connections to airport employees. And he had ambition. When plans for the Lufthansa Heist began forming in 1978, what would become the largest cash robbery in American history at the time, Morrie played a facilitating role. He connected Burke's crew to the inside man, Louis Werner. For that introduction, Morrie expected compensation, a fixed percentage, not a handshake, not a favor, a number. That number mattered. Because in organized crime, associates live in a fragile position. They earn. They risk. But they do not have protection. A made man in the Lucchese hierarchy answered to a capo answered to a boss. The chain was rigid. Morrie answered to no one formally, which meant no one was obligated to protect him. He believed his value gave him leverage. He misunderstood the system. Inside this structure, value only lasts until the money is secured. After that, liability replaces loyalty. And by late 1978, Morrie Kessler had unknowingly crossed from asset to problem. December 11, 1978. A cold pre-dawn wind swept across the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Inside a Lufthansa cargo terminal vault, nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry sat waiting for transfer. By sunrise, it was gone. The robbery was precise, surgical, the largest cash heist in American history at the time. No wild gunfire, no chaotic chase, just controlled intimidation and inside knowledge. At the center stood James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, an associate of the Lucchese crime family who operated with the authority of a captain, but without the ceremony of induction. Burke understood something critical about power inside organized crime. Money equals leverage. Leverage equals autonomy. He had spent years building a hijacking crew that functioned almost like a parallel government inside the Lucchese structure. They generated millions. The official hierarchy tolerated them because they earned. But the Lufthansa score changed the equation. $6 million in 1978 was not just profit. It was destabilizing. Every participant expected a cut. Drivers, gunmen, facilitators, airport contacts, associates like Morrie Kessler. And here lies the structural flaw of large-scale organized crime operations. The bigger the payout, the larger the circle of knowledge. The larger the circle, the greater the risk. Burke's crew operated on discipline and fear, But sudden wealth introduces variables, spending patterns, loose talk, gambling sprees, flashy cars. Federal agents began watching immediately. The FBI understood something too. You don't need witnesses if you follow money. Within weeks, paranoia seeped into the crew. Burke saw threats everywhere, not necessarily betrayal, but exposure. And in that environment, payouts became dangerous. Because every unpaid participant remained dependent. But every paid participant could disappear. Morrie believed he was owed a percentage for connecting the inside man. He believed the agreement bound Burke. But Burke wasn't thinking about fairness. He was thinking about containment. And containment in that world often meant subtraction. The Lufthansa heist did not elevate the crew. It put them on a clock. The robbery was flawless. The aftermath was not. Within days of the Lufthansa score, the spending began. Expensive coats, new cars, nightclubs, cash moving too fast. Burke saw the pattern forming. He had always ruled through generosity and violence in equal measure, but now generosity created visibility, and visibility invited indictments. The first body appeared on December 18, 1978. Parnell Stacks Edwards, the driver assigned to dispose of the getaway van, failed to follow instructions. The vehicle was found parked in Brooklyn. That mistake alone could unravel everything. He was executed inside his girlfriend's apartment. It did not stop there. Over the following weeks, participants and peripheral associates began disappearing. Some were found shot, others were never located. Each killing carried the same logic. Less people, less risk. Meanwhile, Morrie Kessler kept calling. He wanted his agreed percentage. He reminded Burke of the introduction to Louis Werner. He referenced the arrangement. He pressed. Publicly, nothing changed. Morrie still appeared at gatherings, still joked, still wore loud suits and louder ties. Privately, he had become an irritant. Not because he talked to authorities. There is no evidence he cooperated. He talked about money. And money, after Lufthansa, was the most dangerous subject in New York. Burke faced a dilemma. Pay Morrie and acknowledge a debt that could be traced. Refuse Morrie and risk him escalating, perhaps legally, perhaps socially. Morrie was not threatening violence. He was threatening accountability. Inside the rigid ecosystem surrounding the Lucchese crime family, that was worse. The turning point was not a shouting match. It was a calculation. Burke had already decided that anyone connected to the heist who was not essential would eventually disappear. Morrie simply made himself impossible to ignore. And once a man becomes a problem inside organized crime, the solution rarely changes. The Lufthansa robbery did not happen in isolation. By late 1978, federal law enforcement had already intensified its assault on organized crime. Prosecutors were refining the use of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a legal weapon designed to dismantle entire criminal enterprises rather than prosecute isolated crimes. The five families were under pressure. Capos were being surveilled. Wiretaps were expanding. Grand juries were active. The leadership of the Lucchese crime family could tolerate hijackings. They could tolerate gambling. Those were contained operations. But the Lufthansa heist became national news. Newspapers ran headlines. Television anchors repeated the dollar figure nightly. The FBI assigned major resources. Airport security procedures were reviewed. Politicians demanded answers. Public spectacle is poison to organized crime. Because organized crime survives in shadow, not spotlight. Jimmy Burke's crew had generated enormous profit for years, but they were still associates. They did not have the insulation of formal membership. They did not sit inside the family's protected political circle. If indictments came, Burke would not be shielded the way a captain might be. And within the hierarchy, that made him expendable. This is where paranoia transforms into strategy. Every participant in the heist represented a potential witness under federal pressure. Not necessarily an informant, but a liability once arrested. Burke understood federal leverage. Long sentences create cooperation. Fear creates testimony. The safest structure from his perspective was reduction. Reduce the circle. Reduce exposure. Reduce financial disputes. Morrie's persistent demands for his percentage did more than irritate Burke. They created paper risk. If Morrie pursued civil recovery, if he spoke openly about being owed money tied to the robbery, it would formalize connections investigators were still trying to prove. Inside organized crime, silence is not the only rule. Control is. And at this stage, control meant eliminating anyone who could create external pressure, intentionally or not. The political climate did not cause Morrie's death, but it narrowed Burke's options. And in a shrinking field of choices, violence becomes administrative. By early January 1979, the circle had grown noticeably smaller. Men who had celebrated the Lufthansa score weeks earlier were gone, some buried, some vanished. The crew felt it even if no one spoke about it openly. Silence became survival. Jimmy Burke was no longer operating as a charismatic leader. He was calculating, watching, listening, measuring loyalty not by words but by absence of noise. Morrie Kessler, however, did not disappear. He kept calling. He appeared at social spots asking about his share. He reminded intermediaries of the agreement. He complained about being stalled. It wasn't loud defiance. It was persistence. And persistence, inside an organization orbiting the Lucchese crime family, could look like instability. Associates do not demand. Associates wait. Morrie did not understand that his leverage had expired the moment the cash was secured. Without formal induction, he had no internal avenue for arbitration, no capo to appeal to, no structured protection. He began considering options outside the crew. Not informing, not testifying, but civil pressure. The possibility that he might seek legal recourse for his percentage introduced a new threat: documentation, discovery, subpoenas, questions asked under oath. Burke's world functioned on undocumented understandings. Once agreements become paperwork, the state enters the room. Burke had already proven willing to eliminate risk quietly. The pattern was established. The decision, by this point, did not require rage. It required approval. And approval, in Mafia culture, does not always mean a formal sit-down. Sometimes it means the absence of objection from higher authority, silent consent from those who prefer not to know details. Morrie was no longer useful. He was no longer protected by utility. He had become a variable. And variables get removed. Rockaway Parkway, Brooklyn. The wig shop was open. Morrie Kessler sat in his office upstairs. He was not hiding, not armed, not preparing for violence. He was expecting business. The men who arrived that afternoon were familiar, connected to Jimmy Burke's crew, faces he had seen at dinners, card games, casual meetings. The door buzzed. They entered calmly. There was no argument recorded, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation about money. The decision had already been made elsewhere. One of the men pulled a handgun. 2 shots. Close range. Execution style. Morrie collapsed beside the very business that symbolized his attempt to balance legitimacy with criminal proximity. The killing was efficient. Not theatrical. Not emotional. Because by this point, it was procedural. The hit fit a pattern already unfolding around the Lufthansa robbery, individuals connected to the operation being quietly erased. There was no public declaration, no message delivered through spectacle. Just subtraction. Burke did not need to scream about betrayal. Morrie had not betrayed him. He had asked for what he believed he was owed. Inside the machinery orbiting the Lucchese crime family, that was enough. The myth that later formed that Morrie died because he talked too much simplifies the reality. He was not executed for chatter. He was executed because unresolved financial obligations create instability. And instability invites scrutiny. The shots in that small Brooklyn office were not about silencing noise. They were about erasing debt. The math had been settled. Morrie Kessler's body was discovered hours later, slumped near the office desk. Brooklyn whispers began immediately. The word Lufthansa was hushed but pervasive. Associates pieced together the pattern: missing men, sudden disappearances, quiet executions. Federal investigators tightened surveillance. The FBI had already been monitoring Burke and his crew. After Morrie's death, the net began closing faster. They tracked phone calls, questioned employees, followed financial trails. The heist scale now carried consequences beyond local power dynamics. It had drawn national attention. Inside the crew, fear became the dominant currency. Associates no longer spoke freely, even in private. Every conversation was measured, every visit scrutinized, trust fractured. Relationships built over decades eroded in weeks. Jimmy Burke, meanwhile, maintained outward calm. He continued to attend card games, nightclubs, and social events as if nothing had occurred. Yet the execution of Morrie Kessler set a precedent. It communicated silently. Debts, disagreements, and liabilities were resolved efficiently and permanently. The myth propagated quickly. Hollywood, books, and tabloids eventually claimed Morrie was killed for talking. The story simplified, sanitized, and dramatized the truth. Few understood that his death was an administrative decision, a cold calculation designed to protect money, power, and the crew's operational security. In the wake of the murder, the crew continued collecting the Lufthansa cash. Some members disappeared. Some were eventually caught by law enforcement. Burke himself faced indictments years later, though never convicted for Morrie's death. The ripple effects of that day continued to shape organized crime in Brooklyn for years, leaving a trail of fear, uncertainty, and quiet lessons about leverage, loyalty, and survival. The facade of camaraderie had vanished. Only the machinery of control remained. Morrie Kessler's death was never about chatter. It was about leverage, about control, about understanding that inside the Lucchese crime family, relationships exist only as long as utility survives. In the calculus of organized crime, loyalty is transactional. Silence is secondary. Money and exposure are primary. Morrie understood the numbers. He understood the arrangements, but he overestimated the power of knowledge when stripped of formal protection. The lesson is stark. In a system that operates on shadow and omission, being right is not the same as being safe. The strongest man in the room is not always the one with firepower. It is the one who can manipulate fear, perception, and incentive. Burke ruled not through affection, but through calculation, methodical subtraction of risk. And yet in that quiet Brooklyn office, the human cost is unmistakable. A man seated behind a desk, doing nothing more than asserting a right, could be erased in seconds. It returns us circularly to the first scene. The calm morning, the familiar faces, the abrupt finality. Morrie's story haunts because it reveals the invisible architecture of violence, the cold arithmetic behind every disappearance, the unspoken rules of power. In the end, it is not betrayal that kills. It is utility expiring. And in the machinery of organized crime, once your number comes up, nothing else matters. The room falls silent again. The wigs hang undisturbed. And the lesson lingers. In the shadow world of money, fear, and hierarchy, understanding too much can be just as dangerous as talking.